So that having been said, let's just go ahead and jump into it. So when we look at information security as a broad category here at Passageway, we really like to think about information security as having three essential elements. We're really interested in confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And if you were to go out to ISACA or COBIT, any of the regulatory sort of frameworks for information security, they would address these three areas as three of the primary areas that need to be addressed whenever you're looking at any information security, whether it's for a board product or for your network access controls, really anything that's going on in your environment. So let's talk a little bit about what each one of these means. Confidentiality is simply keeping information private, making sure that it is only accessed by people who have a right to that information. Integrity really is about making sure that the information is consistent. The information that you saw and saved is the same information when you open that file that it was when you saved it originally. That gives us a good view over time of whether of the documents that have been edited, who edited them, when they were edited, and that sort of thing. And we can have confidence then that the data that we're using to make decisions is the data that we should be using. And finally, we talk about availability. And for information technology people, availability is a thing that causes many of us to lose sleep at night. Because if you came up through the ranks in the information technology field, system down is always the worst thing that you can hear. And that's really what availability is about. It's really not only about is the information or the systems up and running, but are the services that need to be running on the systems running? Is the information available in multiple places maybe, or was it backed up appropriately? Have we done a proper risk assessment about how long we can afford for certain information not to be available? And so whenever we're looking at information security concerns, the availability of information is certainly one of those. Most recently, the biggest issue with availability has been ransomware. And so the idea that your data might suddenly become unavailable because someone has compromised the integrity of your system, typically by breaking some access control that was tied to confidentiality, is sort of the perfect storm of all these security elements coming together, and one of the worst things that can happen to you at this point in time. Sorry, we're having a little problem here with the keyboard control. So we have this question that we're going to ask you guys about organizational level controls in your organization. You know, Stephanie mentioned that I've been in charge of information security in a couple of different organizations, and my experience has been that there are times when we don't necessarily enforce the same level of control for our board members that we do for our staff members. And we have some examples here. You know, sometimes we require strong passwords for staff, but we don't want to inconvenience the board members by making them also have a 15-character password with letters and numbers and special characters in it. Sometimes we don't allow staff to bring their own devices to work, but we do allow board members to access confidential board materials using devices that they purchased themselves and which we have no control over. And sometimes we have rules against emailing information among staff or outside of the organization, but sometimes I know board members get information via email that may be confidential. And so those are some things that we're looking at. So it looks like on the poll here, so about 22% of you are reporting that you do have the same level. 30% say no, and 30% say you're working on it. Well, now we're even, 30, 30, and 30 as we look there. So, and only 10% or 9% now are in the I don't know. it looks like, you know, this is an area where we might need some work, right? So as more people have weighed in, we're up to about 42% yes, which I think is really great. That 42% of the respondents so far have said that they are enforcing the same levels of control. That's really good, and it really should be something that you work toward in your organization. So if you're not already there, the other 46 or so % of you who are not quite at that point, it would be a really good thing for you to continue down that path. So one of the things that I want to do is talk about the connection between those three essential elements, the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability, and how we tie them to specific controls in your environment. So every one of the organizational controls you have, maybe it's your password policy, maybe it's your physical access policy to the building that you work in. Whatever that is, there's a control mechanism and a control policy around that, and that's always impacted by and causes an impact to the essential elements: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So for any control, we should be able to communicate what the connection is to those essential elements, right? And an example that we have here on the screen is about physical access controls to your data center. You know, we look here and we say, well, confidentiality is served in a control in which data is not accessible to non-authorized users, right? We put controls on our data center to keep the data under our own control so that nobody else has access to the data. Similarly, not only can they not take the data, but they can't change the data. And I will tell you, as an information security person, one of the things that is of more concern even than a down system from my perspective is being able to rely on the integrity of the data that's being held in the system, because a system that's just not available can be recovered. In the integrity of a system, if the data is just wrong and you aren't aware that it has been changed, that can cause a real impact on your organization. And then again, in terms of the data center availability, right, the servers and data are not subject to harm by outsiders if you have good physical access controls for your data center. So that would be an example of how we could tie certain controls to certain specific elements. If we look at some other examples, right, we can look at multi-factor authentication, which is simply using multiple means of identifying that a person is the person that we believe them to be. Right? We always think of something you had, something you know, and something you are. Those are all factors that you can use, and adding those together as a multiple factors increases the level of assurance that we have that the person that we think is acting is in fact the person who is acting. And so, so again, here looking at the extended example, we want to make sure that access is available to the correct person. That increases our confidentiality. At the same time, we want to block access to incorrect or non-authorized persons, which also increases confidentiality. And in a lot of organizations, non-repudiation is a security factor. It's a big 75-cent word. But non-repudiation is simply, the idea that if we believe that a person did a thing, whatever that thing might be, and they say it wasn't me, that's their repudiation. Non-repudiation is the ability to tie that individual to the specific act. So if I can say, look, it was your username, it was your password, and it was your fingerprint, and the file shows that you were the username that edited the document, chances are really good that's the person who edited the document. Username and password alone, it gets a little iffy, right? Simply a username to log into something, right? And that they can clearly say, well, anybody would know my username. It's my first letter and my last name. So I think we have a poll here. We have a poll here, Stephanie, about this. So poll's open. Do you provide multi-factor authentication for your online banking or for mobile applications or internal network access for your systems in your environment, right? So that poll is open. If you would participate, we would appreciate it. We're going to use all this information later.
But of course, right? That's right? What we do with data.
This is how we log that you were actually active in the webinar. So while that's rolling in, you know, we see it kind of spread, right? I think, what do we got? A little over a third say yes, and that's good. And then we sort of have, you know, some people who are kind of either working toward it or not planning to do it, or just don't know whether it's being used. So, you know, I would encourage you, if you're looking for ways to increase the security of your systems and the data that is stored in those systems, multi-factor authentication is certainly a good way to go to as an easy sort of first step to increase those confidentiality and integrity levels. So, moving on, audit logging. This is a specific control, and if you are a part of an organization which gets examined by any of the FFIEC organizations or any other examiner, you're in any kind of regulated industry, you will know and be aware that those folks always want to look at your logs. They always want to see what you're tracking and what you're not tracking. Those are the things that end up on the bad report, the things you're not tracking, right? And so what is audit logging, right? It's just tracking who did what. And the only reason I want to know that is because it really increases the integrity of my entire system, right? We sort of talk about integrity in a couple of different ways, and maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but so when we talk about integrity, there's not only the integrity of a specific data element. What is Bill Arnold's age, right? So that one data element could be changed. But there are also integrity issues at a higher level, which are things like what password is embedded in a file that is being used, and does that then get compromised and provide access to something else in your organization, which decreases the integrity potentially of that data, right? So there's a lot more to the integrity piece when you're running systems than just who did what, but at a higher level, what's potentially changeable? And it provides support for compliance. Compliance folks always want to know that the right things are being tracked. And there are, in every industry that I've worked with, there are standards around what you need to know. And one of the things that you need to know is who participated in meetings, who was involved in decision making. When I worked at Service Credit Union, we were very conscious of keeping track of who showed up at management team meetings, so you knew who was in the room at the particular time that we discussed a particular item. So always good, and of course, our examiners always wanted to see those notes to see who was there when the discussion was held. And we've got a poll for that. That poll is open. Do you log activities, right? So to give you some guidance on this, if you haven't already answered, you could be looking at certainly your IT staff is logging whoever logs in via VPN. That's being logged somewhere. Where it gets interesting is a lot of times you find that people don't necessarily log who accessed an application or a specific piece of data. And those are some elements which you could increase, right? So yeah, we're seeing we're seeing 62% of the folks say that yes, they do it 100% of the time. That's a phenomenal number. That's really good. Additional 8% for apps and solutions accessed outside your network. So that's really good. For those of you who don't know but might be interested, it would be a good place for you to sort of dig in a little bit, and either your compliance folks or your IT staff might be able to give you some direction on those. Global permission management, right? So if we think about permissions, right? You may have permission to access an item on the network. You're able to log into the network and you have an email account that uses the same username and password. And frankly, for your email, you may never use your password because it's embedded in all these different places. You're using apps, you're using web services, whatever it might be. But there's a piece about knowing who it is and taking that who it is and moving that to another level, which is what should they be able to do? And it may be based on their role. It may be based on their individual, who they are as an individual. This is an area, this access control piece comes up a lot in, I know in financial institutions, because frequently what happens is individuals move from one piece of the organization to another piece of the organization, and often the IT folks or whoever is tasked with that don't necessarily modify the permissions that that person has when they move to a new section of the organization. So separating sort of what you can access and who else you can modify the access controls for from what you actually have access to is a really important feature that you want to look for in your organization, right? So your IT staff, for instance, may have full control over your network and have the permission to say who has access to what, but their own access levels should be very limited in terms of what content they have access to, because there's almost nothing about the internal workings of your business that your IT staff really needs to be privy to. So that's a connection where you can disconnect that, right? If global permission management provides a stronger control for non-repudiation because there are less people who have access to any particular thing, and so who accessed it is much easier to do. I really sort of already talked about the IT staff managing permissions without access to the data, which actually increases your availability in the sense that, which isn't necessarily obvious, in the sense that anyone on the IT staff who has the appropriate level of control to manage permissions for others can give the appropriate person access to the content that they need. And so that's an important part in terms of availability, because somebody might need to edit something and the right person isn't there, but somebody else can authorize it. And so we see, all right, 75% don't know. No, wait, we're on a different poll, right?
Yeah, so as you think about your organization, again, kind of extending to some different solutions that you have internally. Here we're looking at what kind of access you allow for your internal staff in order to access any member or consumer data, within the solutions or the platforms or applications that you're currently providing. Yes, you
certainly want to limit that to just the right people. And so that's good. That is a number that I don't know number is kind of high for, in general. I would really encourage any of you who are on the webinar to dig into that a little bit. Because one of the things that I know as a IT leader in a financial institution, one of the things that we worried about constantly was that staff would somehow be held accountable for transactions that occurred in a member's account. So we always wanted to make sure, kind of tying the global permission management to the audit logging, we always wanted to make sure that the IT staff didn't have these permissions to be able to do these things as a member, which would then show up in an audit log as, oh, look, that was logged from this terminal that's internal was doing this activity, right? So it was important to have that audit log. So, all right. So last extended example here that I want to talk about was geo-replication. And so this is really another big word. What it really means is, multiple copies in multiple places. sometimes, this specific control is a control around data availability, is its real thing, right? As IT people, we're constantly looking at how do we make sure that the data is available to the business. And we talk about incident management, we talk about disaster recovery, we talk about business continuity. All of those are things that tie into what is the availability of our systems and data to the business, because that's why the systems exist, is to serve the business. So when we talk about georeplication, for instance, when I was at Purdue Federal, we built a secondary data center as far from our main data center as we could within our own footprint, right? Which is good, but it's limited. It's a limited georeplication. With cloud service availability, there's certainly a much larger case that can be made for georeplication. There are a number of services that have come up in the last couple of years. Datto is one of them, that are really just cloud-based storage solutions. That's really all they are, but that provide some really interesting services. What's great about it is if you are using a true georeplication service, it gives you the ability to take those granular permissions that we talked about in the earlier slides, and they get replicated across all those environments as well. And so you don't have to worry about, am I keeping my controls in sync? Am I keeping my data in sync? Because that happens sort of for you. And so the question here is, do you do this? Do you replicate data within your organization? Do you replicate it in different locations? What are you doing about data replication?
And it's really interesting to kind of see how the technology landscape allows us so much more flexibility today than what we've had in the past.
Absolutely.
For how that is maintained, and just kind of seeing the shift in philosophy in some cases for, the criticality of this replication. Especially as we continue to move more and more into a digital age, and the dependency on things like paper, continue to shift away. So very interested to see what your feedback is here. I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll and share those results with you at this point.
And it looks like they're really strong, right? You've got about, 88% that know that they are, and the other piece is just folks who just aren't aware, right? And that's not that unusual, especially given the range of roles that we have in the webinar today. That's not really surprising. And it's not really surprising to me that folks are using replication in various, and I really like, it's interesting, I really like the fact that there are a smaller set that are actually doing it for specific things, right? Because one of the things that we find is just like people who do a backup of their hard drive, right? There's a lot of junk on your hard drive that you don't really need to back up, right?
Oh, come on, we need it all, Bill, all the time, right?
You don't need it. You don't need it. So I'm really glad to see that some people are looking at that data and saying, well, this is the data that's critical to our business that we need to move and make sure it's always available to us and that has the right controls around it. But really, the recipe contest that we had in 1997 that is still stored on the S drive does not need to be replicated because everybody who ever wanted it already had it. All right, well, that kind of moves us to a different set of information now. And this is, I wanted to sort of tag this on to what we were doing today. In June of 2017, Google commissioned a cloud security survey. They sponsored it, so we'll take it with a little grain of salt. But it was conducted and reported out by MIT, and it really talked about the shift to the cloud. And so the data points that I put in here, and there's just two slides on this. So this one is about what's moving to the cloud. And so these were a set of organizations that were sort of spread across sizes and localities. But the movement of applications, data, and infrastructure to the cloud, of those organizations, 24% had moved something. In 2017, 44% of the applications, data, and infrastructure of these organizations had moved to the cloud. And these organizations were predicting that by 2019, 65% of their applications data infrastructure would be in the cloud. Now, what I found really interesting about this was that the confidence in cloud security has increased dramatically since 2015. So 25% of respondents said that they had the same level of confidence in cloud security now that they did in 2015. Here's what we don't know. What was their confidence level in 2015? If these people already believed that cloud security was great, then the fact that it stayed the same is also, they still believe it's great, right? We don't know. 74% of the respondents had increased confidence in cloud security. We also don't know what their original point was. Where were they in 2015? We do know that 1% of the respondents indicated that their confidence in cloud security had decreased since 2015. So if you were a 10 and now you're a 9, then on a scale of 1 to 10, then, you know, not so bad. And if those increases were from 8s to 9s and the stayed the same, we're all already 10s, you know, we don't know exactly what this says about the confidence measure as an absolute. We do know about the trend line. The trend line is 3 times as many people were, you know, believed that there was increased cloud security since 2015. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, and as Bill continues this conversation, we're going to launch our last poll here, really just to get some feedback from you on, you know, what you're doing related to cloud, and then we'll come back and kind of finish the rest of this conversation.
Super. So, last slide of mine. So what's, you know, the real question is what's driving that shift? What is driving the shift to the cloud? And so, first 3 bullets are all carryovers, but here are the top 2 reasons, neck and neck. Agility and speed to market came in as 45% of respondents were moving things to the cloud in order to get better agility and better speed to market. Followed very closely by increased confidence in cloud security as the number 2 reason across the survey why people and organizations were moving their apps and infrastructure and data to the cloud. And what were they moving? What were the top uses? Now, these numbers are what they're currently doing and what they are projected to do in the next 2 years, which means in 2019, you know, what is that, 92% of these organizations expect to have some data storage in the cloud. 93% expect to have their collaboration and productivity tools in the cloud. That number, 93%, of all the areas that were, all the uses that were in the document, 93% was the largest number for things that would be going to the cloud. And it was collaboration and productivity. And I thought that was very interesting because it certainly does increase our ability to collaborate across not only space but time when things are cloud-based. So I found that interesting, and I hope that you will find it interesting as well. So what are we doing here? 20% are cloud all the way, 30% are increasing, 30% are considering it, and 20% don't have any plans to do so. So it's really across the spectrum, and I think that that's not that unusual. There's a lot of organizations who are continuing to assess security, and I will tell you that if you go look up this cloud security report from Google, that for those people who have not moved anything to the cloud, the concerns about information security are the #1 reason that they have not. And yet we still see all of that information about, you know, that's the #2 reason that people are moving things to the cloud is an increased, you know, reliance on the security of the cloud. So it's a mixed bag, kind of like our results.
Yeah, right.
I'll turn it over to you, Stephanie.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bill, for all of the insights here that you've shared. This has been extremely beneficial, certainly on our end. And as we continue to, you know, move things forward with the OnBoard solution that you guys are all using today in your organizations, I think first and foremost that's important to share is security is one of the cornerstones of this platform and has been really since its inception. So we incorporate the need for security and the ability for you to demonstrate that security internally as part of that platform automatically. We can certainly dig into a lot of additional things that, we can answer and provide some additional clarification for you guys if you have any questions on what that looks like. But what I do want to take a few moments just to share with you, as some of you may not be aware, really is some details around our Enterprise Edition. As we look at this particular package, we have incorporated the increased need for demonstrated security for purposes of, maintaining relevance with compliance and staying on top of the regulatory demands of your organization, and of course, just the inherent need as an institution to protect your team, your organization, and those individuals that you work with, as members or customers or consumers. And so a couple of things just to kind of tag on what Bill has already covered today. The Enterprise Edition does incorporate a couple of pieces that I think are important for you to be aware of. One, we've got a two-factor authentication component. There's a global permission management system, the ability to generate and pull IT security logs from the system. We do have this package set up with an active geo-replication, instance. And then in addition to that, there's some really cool things that we've done just to make this particular package, while it has an increased layer of security, what we would call, our gold standard, we also added some additional components just to make this particular experience more user-friendly, for the folks that you have that are leveraging it as well. Just a very quick high-level overview, if you've not had a chance to see any of these pieces. The two-factor authentication basically, as Bill shared, it's your ability to have a validation of who you are as an individual. And so when this is enabled, you've got the ability to, validate that via email. You can validate it with SMS. And it's a very, very simple process. This is a unique generated code every time you are accessing the system. Just again provides that added layer of security. In addition, we've got an audit logging component that's been incorporated. We've got some really great, fantastic data that we're providing for your organization for review, and we're continuing to enhance this as well. So the reports that you can pull out of the system, are varying, but we just kind of provided an illustration of a couple of those pieces. What's really helpful here is to be able to see in some situations when people are viewing the materials. These are certainly helpful to be able to ensure, that everyone is getting in, they're being prepared in advance of the meetings. That is important from an overall governance perspective, and just to, maintain the engagement levels. But secondary to that, from a security perspective, the ability to demonstrate when the system is accessed. More importantly, if you enable downloads of materials, when those were downloaded and by whom. You can see here there's a couple of additional components like the IP address, where you can be able to validate basically, where the system is being accessed from, and ensure that that is in line with what your internal policies are around your system and around the access here. So a lot of really great additional data components that are available at your disposal. Again, we'll continue to add to this over the course of time. One of the things that's also part of the enterprise package is a global permission management system. As Bill was talking about the need to separate out some of your internal IT controls for things along the lines of permission management, this does give you the ability to establish what we call a super admin user who only has access to the permission structure within the system. There's no extended access to any meeting content, any content that's incorporated into your approvals or your resources, questionnaires and things along those lines. But it is the ability to ensure that as permissions need to be amended or changed because of changes in your organization, then you have the flexibility to do so in line with your current IT security controls. So really nice to have that added flexibility and an added layer of oversight as far as that permissioning. Now, here's kind of the fun piece, right? So we're talking about security that sometimes is not the most engaging or fun conversation. because there's a lot of fear. No, but
Sure.
there's some really great additional enhancements in Enterprise, and if it's something, again, you're not currently using today, I would certainly encourage you to take a look. What you're seeing here is just kind of a quick view of a dashboard. Pane, this kind of is designed to increase engagement and make the system more user-friendly, again, for the folks who are jumping in. Kind of provide a more engaging visual experience, but also very quickly centralize the information that is needed, whether it be upcoming meetings, a pending approval that needs participation. It could be some high-level resources that have just been, updated and extended, for example, to your board members, or even just a message around your organization. This is one of the pieces that you have full control over, and flexibility to design and ensure that the experience is meeting the needs of your users. And in addition to that, there certainly is an Office integration. Not sure if you're aware of that, but a really great way to connect certain files, actually, that may get updated on a frequent basis to your organization, and incorporating the same authentication or your credentials that ensure proper access even internally. So with that being said, I want to take a quick moment here and open things up for questions and see what you guys want to dig into here. There was one question that was asked a little bit earlier. This was from Scott Patton, and he wanted to know, how does one implement logging activity? And that is a really good question. Scott, when you're asking that question, are you asking that specifically for OnBoard, or are you talking more inside of the organization? And I'm going to give you kind of a quick second here. If you want, I can certainly unmute you and have you kind of ask that question directly as well. And while we go through that, again, for anyone else, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand, or you can post that question, and we can come back and make sure to address it. All right. And so, Scott, it looks like you're really looking for more feedback around inside the organization, and in an organization that may be a little bit smaller in size, without a dedicated role to address the needs for logging. What recommendations
Right.
did you have, Bill?
Oh, thanks, Stephanie, and thanks for asking the question. I think that the place to probably start, the place that I would start is certainly looking at access controls as the first place that you want to make sure that you're implementing logging. Right? So activity logging, by and large, comes later. If you're sort of looking at a number of different sort of levels of control, one of the things that I would look at in terms of those levels of control, I don't know what sort of an organization you're with, but if you were to go out and look at the cybersecurity assessment tool from the FFIEC, they have a number of different sort of maturity levels that they look at, including a baseline level, which is sort of their baseline expectation of what you should be logging. And once you're really clear about what you should be logging, the actual turning on that logging gets to be pretty clear. And any IT doesn't have to be a security consultant as much as any kind of IT system administrator should be able to take the information, if you can clearly articulate what you want to log, they should be able to take that information and implement it. If, for instance, it's you're running a Windows domain, those controls are all done on the domain controller. If you're looking at access controls on your SharePoint or on your on your web presence, whatever, each one of those sort of has its own sorts of methods of turning on the logging. If you want to kind of start at the top instead of at the bottom, the other way to go would be to look at a security information and escalation platform, which would have levels that you could implement along the way with some professional services that would probably be tied to that. Typically, you find that upkeeping that is not difficult. It's just the setup, the initial setup. that sort of takes some time and testing to make sure that you've got it right.
Okay, and thanks for that question, Scott.
Could I just say one more thing, Scott? If you want to send me a direct email with any other detailed questions, it's warnold@passageways.com, and I'll be happy to take that off.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We did have another question from Susan asking about the Office integration. So again, with the enterprise package, you have the ability to download a Connect for Office. And the individual who may want to use this would need to download that the connector directly on their desktop or their laptop, whatever their primary device is in that respect. That will allow them the ability, for example, to open up a Word or Excel or PowerPoint file that will then provide them a login to OnBoard directly, which is pretty amazing. Once you do that, then you can see the meeting structure. Again, it's going to follow your natural credentials and the permissions that are associated with them. So, for example, you would be able to see any meetings you have access to. As long as you are a contributor of a meeting or the administrator of a meeting, then you would be able to connect a specific file that you're working on, again, in one of those applications, to an agenda section in OnBoard. And what that means is then you can just update that file directly from your desktop or your laptop without having to reload that into OnBoard. And if anyone has the need for maybe some additional training to extend that functionality, please let us know, Susan. I'll follow up with you on that one specifically just to make sure that you guys are all good to go there. So thank you for that question. And it looks at this point in time like we don't have any further questions. Certainly, if you do, following this session, you'll have contact information. Please reach out to us,
yeah.
And we can certainly get you in contact with Bill as needed as well.
Sure.
And if you're thinking about or considering the enterprise package, you can certainly reach out also to your customer success manager. So let us know what you guys think. If you have any additional questions or ways that we can further help improve the security story in your organization, that's what we're here to do. So with that, I want to thank you guys very much for sharing some of your time with us. As a quick reminder, we'll send out the recording and the slides. There is a survey, so please share your feedback with us. And as always, thank you for being a valued member of the Passageways family. And you guys all have an awesome rest of your Thursday. Thanks, guys.